Hi, welcome everyone. We've really been looking forward to this interview. I'm Melanie from MJ Justice Project, and with me is my partner in crime, Buds. And we're very excited for today's interview. We're going to talk to Howard Bloom. And if most of you know, Mr. Bloom has been regarded as the greatest press agent that Rockefeller has ever known. He's also a science nerd, a self-professed science nerd who knew nothing about popular music, but still he founded the biggest PR firm in the music industry and helped build careers of rock legends or just pop legends like Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, Paul Simon, and there are hundreds of more, and I could add more names to that list. His latest book is called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, and we are very excited, and we want to welcome Mr. Howard Bloom. Welcome, sir. How
Thanks,
are you?
Melanie. Good, good. I'm very anxious to get going because I've been on a crusade to redeem Michael Jackson ever since the 1980s. He's the most important person I've ever met in my life, and he's a person who set a standard of awe, wonder, and absolute commitment to his kids, to his audience. I've never seen anything like in my life. I never expected to see from any quarter anything like what Michael was, and he was so far beyond. Look, I've worked with Prince and Bob Marley and all those people you mentioned, Billy Idol, Bill Joel, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, all kinds of very, very important people. And now I work with, because as you said, I'm a science person, and I work with Buzz Aldrin and Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man on the moon, who unfortunately died 3 years ago. So I've been working, and I'm running a team right now with the former governor of New York State and with, of all people, Newt Gingrich. I'm a Democrat and a liberal, but I believe in working across the aisle to get things done, and a three-star general. And despite all of these people, Michael Jackson towers over all of them as if he is 10 times their size, because again, that degree of awe, wonder, and absolute commitment in Michael made him a human being closer to the gods than to the human.
Wow, we all agree with you. Absolutely. I do have a question. How does a self-professed science nerd like yourself get connected to the biggest star on the planet? How did that happen?
A series of accidents, Melanie, and it's much too long to tell. Let's see if I can summarize it. When I was 12 years old, I realized I was an atheist. And I didn't confess it to myself because I had a bar mitzvah coming up, and I didn't want to miss out on the presents. So when the presents were all in, and when I'd written all the thank you cards and everything, I confessed to myself that I was an atheist, and it was just before the Jewish high holidays. And my parents were absolutely committed to dragging me to the temple. It was the most important time of the year for them. And I remember the car drove us, my father's blue Fraser four-door automobile, drove us to Richmond Avenue where the temple was. And then I refused to get out of the car. And my parents were tugging at my ankles, literally shredding my socks to try to drag me up the street like a bag of cement to the temple. And I was holding on to the door frame. And I had a sudden realization. According to me, as an atheist, there are no gods in the heavens, there are no gods beneath the earth. So where are the gods in this scene? They're in my parents. They're in the passion with which my parents are trying to drag me up the street. And if they're in my parents, they're in me. Now, Galileo, one of my heroes, accomplished what he accomplished by taking a lens and turning it up to the sky, a totally unexpected direction to turn a lens, and beginning to see that there weren't perfect spheres in the heavens, which is what everybody thought up to that point. There were lumpy rocks up there. And he changed the way we think about the universe. And a guy named Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who was another one of my idols, these guys have been my idols since I was 10 years old, took a lens. He was a draper, so he imported fabrics to Amsterdam, and he used the lens to see how fine the fabrics were, how tight the weave was, how regular the weave was. And he turned that horizontal lens, he turned it down, an unexpected direction, and looked at pond water and saw what he called animalcules, little tiny animals that humans had never known existed before, but have been coexisting with us ever since we evolved. So I realized that my job was to turn the lens inside of us and find the gods inside. And through a long series of accidents, I mean, I turned down fellowships from 4 grad schools in neuroscience because I thought that grad school would be Auschwitz for the mind. I would never find the gods inside of us if I went to grad school, because I'd be giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students in exchange for a psychology credit. And how frequently are you going to find the ecstatic experience inside of us that manifests the gods, giving paper and pencil tests like that? You'll never find it. So I jumped ship and I went into popular culture by co-founding a commercial art studio, and I made it on the cover of Art Direction magazine, and created a new animation technique for NBC TV, and we did all of the advertising graphics for ABC's 7 FM stations, which began to educate me a little bit in rock and roll. And then I fell into editing a magazine, a rock and roll magazine of all things, and I fell from that into doing publicity. And then one day, Seymour Stein, the president of Sire Records, who signed Madonna, was walking past my office, and he said, "If you're so schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company?" And Melanie, you can challenge me on many things. There are numerous things I can't do. I can't catch a ball. I can't throw a ball. I can't do any normal things. But if you challenge me on my smarts, then you get me where it hurts. So I started my own PR company, and I had a radically different concept of how you should do PR than had ever been done in the industry before. In the industry, you gave each account executive 16 clients, and many of those clients, the account executive didn't even know she had. In my company, if you were an account executive, I gave you 2.5 clients plus, so you could really concentrate on your clients. And meantime, I was the strategist, and I looked over the management situation, and I saw what your manager was good at and what he wasn't good at, and I filled in the stuff that your manager didn't know, usually touring strategy. So I knew how to operate the star-making machine. That was my main thing. And eventually, the Jacksons' manager, when they were planning their victory tour, which was going to be their first reunion in 3 years, it was going to have everybody, their father, the whole family, and their manager started to call me. And I said, "No, I'm not interested." And I said, "No, I'm not interested because Michael was the biggest phenomena in the history of rock and roll. He was bigger than Elvis Presley and the Beatles at that point." And I kept telling them, "Look, you don't need me. I do crusades. You could get a talking dog to say Michael Jackson on the phone, and any editor anywhere in the country would say, 'I'll give him a cover, just give me an interview. You don't need me for that.'" And then one day they called and they said, "The Jacksons are coming into New York. They're going to be staying at the Helmsley Palace. They want to meet with you." Now, look, I didn't grow up among other kids. I didn't grow up among humans. My parents had no time for me. The other kids hated me. They used me as an object of scorn. They beat me up. That's about all they had use for me for. And so I didn't grow up with other human beings, and I didn't know normal rituals. I didn't know what, for example, what having a cup of coffee meant or having a drink meant. But I did know one thing. I had heard that to be a mensch, if you were going to say no to somebody, you owe it to them to say no to their face.
Yes.
So I accepted the meeting with the Jacksons. And on a Saturday night at midnight, I went over to the Helmsley Palace Hotel, and I went to one of the top floors, and I knocked on the appropriate door, and the door opened 4 inches. And as soon as I saw through that crack 4 guys literally up against the wall. There was a commercial, I think it was for TDK audio tape in those days, for cassettes. And it had this guy sitting in a chair, and it probably had a fan that was blowing on him at 120 miles an hour, and he was plastered back up against the seat he was sitting in, and his hair was flying backwards. That's what the 4 brothers looked like to me. And I knew the instant I saw them that these were 4 of the most decent, honest people I had ever met in my life. And they were in serious trouble. So the minute that door opened, I knew I was going to have to say yes to the Jacksons. And that's how I got involved with the Jacksons. I had a reputation, Melanie.
I see.
But because of the way we did business, and because I built star after star after star from anonymity, we had a reputation. So people came to me. I didn't go to them.
Tell me about the first time you met Michael Jackson. I know how you met the brothers, but how did you meet Michael
Right.
Jackson?
Well, I was out in California with the brothers. I started spending 3 days a week with them and 4 days a week working in New York City. I work 7 days a week. I always do. And I was out at Marlin's pool house. Now, pool house is a little building next to the pool that's just big enough to have one room on the first floor and another room on the second floor. And the room on the first floor, the walls were lined with arcade video games. The things that, Pac-Man and stuff like that, but machines that were far too expensive for any normal mortal to own. And in the center of the room, there was a big green pool table. And the brothers and I were huddled around the pool table, looking over merchandising things. And I was trying to explain to them that, look, you stand for awe, wonder, and surprise. So anytime you pick a t-shirt, that t-shirt has to awe you. When you pick a tour jacket, that tour jacket has to awe you. So, and the brothers, they accepted me as another brother, Melanie, which was pretty darned astonishing. So I knew that Michael was coming. And remember, I didn't know human rituals. So when I was 19, somebody taught me this. If there's somebody that you want to meet or other people want you to meet, you walk over to that person and you put your hand out and you say your name. Hi, I'm Howard. But Melanie, I had never done it before. And as we were busy huddling around the table, I heard the screen door open. And I knew it had to be Michael. So I walked over, and something you have to understand, I had read roughly 1,000 stories on Michael Jackson, and every single one of them said he was a bubble baby, that if you put your hand out toward him, he would shrink away from human contact. So I put my hand out and said, hi, I'm Howard. And he put his hand out and he said, hi, I'm Michael. But the voice was more like, hi, I'm Michael. And he shook my hand, and it wasn't a bruising handshake. It was a normal human handshake. And I said, I've got a press release to read you. Could I please, I need your approval on it. Where can we go? So he took me up to the second story, where the one room was filled with keyboards and amplifiers all the way to the ceiling. So he found an amplifier to sit on, and I found an amplifier to sit on. And I started to read him my press release. And after I got 2 sentences into the press release, he went, oh, and I don't know if you can see what my body's doing, but I just slumped a little bit. And then I read him 2 more sentences, and he went, oh, and he slumped a little bit more. And when I got to the end, hang on, we've got to sit up again here. When I got to the end, he said, that's beautiful. Did you write that? Now, I have been writing obsessively since I was 16 years old. When I was 12 years old, through the pages of a book, Albert Einstein had grabbed me by the lapels and said, schmuck, if you want to be a genius, it's not enough to come up with a theory only 3 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then express it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. So Albert Einstein told me through the pages of a book, schmuck, listen up. You want to be an original scientific thinker? You have to be a writer, and not just any writer. You have to be a fabulous writer. So I had started writing furiously at the age of 16 and studying everything I could on writing. And then at NYU, in undergraduate school, I had been named the editor of the literary magazine. And we'd won 2 National Academy of Poets prizes. And the poet in residence at NYU thought I would be the next great poet to come out of NYU. So I put everything I am into those press releases, everything that I've ever been able to teach myself into those press releases. In my entire existence in the publicity industry, something like 17 to 20 years, no one had ever seen the art in what I was doing. Not a single soul until Michael. And he saw the art in every sentence. And then we went downstairs because we had an appointment with the art director from CBS Records, who was going to come over with a whole bunch of artist portfolios so we could pick an artist for the album cover. And when I say we, I mean we. I don't just mean them, because even Michael accepted me as one of the brothers after that very, very short meeting. So the art director came. And she had 5 of the most gorgeous portfolios you've ever seen, hand-tooled leather, hand-tooled cherry wood. And because I got into popular culture through an art studio, I knew who these artists were. They were the legends in their business. And she shoved the first portfolio across the table toward us. Now, I was standing next to Michael, and the brothers were crowded around us. So Michael's left elbow was up against my right elbow. Michael's left knee was up against my right knee. Any muscular language with which he spoke, I was going to get immediately. So we started to look at the first portfolio, and Michael opened the first page an inch, Melanie, just an inch. And he went, oh, and his knees began to buckle. And he opened it another inch, and he went, oh, and his knees began to buckle further. And he went, oh, oh, oh. Michael Jackson saw in that first inch, you know, William Blake talking about seeing the infinite in the tiniest of things.
Yeah.
Michael Jackson saw the infinite in that first square inch of artwork, Melanie. He saw more in that inch of artwork than the artist had ever seen. So look, when I was 10 years old, what saved me, because I was a lost kid, is a book that appeared in my lap that said the first 2 laws of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. The first law is the law of courage. The second law is the law of awe, wonder, curiosity, and surprise. And here I had just seen more awe, wonder, curiosity, and surprise in 3 minutes with Michael than I had ever imagined could possibly exist in my lifetime. More than I would ever see again without Michael. And to me, Michael was the living incarnation now for me of the second law of science. Look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen it before. I was just dumbstruck and astonished. And if you ask me the appropriate question, I'll tell you the story of how I found out that he was also the incarnation of the first law of science: the truth at any price, including the price of your life, courage.
Wow. Well, let me ask you that. Why do you think Michael embodied that?
Well, because one day I was sitting at my desk at Lexington Avenue and 55th Street in Manhattan. I had a 2-story office with a circular staircase. It was really nifty. And I kept a little red nylon knapsack behind my desk, and it had a TRS-100, a Radio Shack computer, the very first laptop computer, and a razor, and a toothbrush, and a spare shirt. Because I would get emergency calls from all over the country saying, you've got to be here in 4 hours, such and such is happening. And this day, the call I got at 4 o'clock in the afternoon was, Michael is canceling his tour. You're the only one he'll listen to. You have to be out here at 11 o'clock tonight, meaning out in LA. So I got my staff to get me a flight to LA and call me a car service. And I ran down the stairs with hundreds of phone calls coming in from journalists who wanted to talk to me so they could talk to Michael Jackson. It was an astonishing time. And I got out to California, and I took my rental car to the address I'd been given, and it was this huge studio lot. But it was dark. It was nighttime. It was 11 o'clock at night, for God's sakes. And the studio lot has these giant aircraft hangar-sized buildings that swallow the light. And all of them were dark but one. And even though there was tons of lighting inside that building, it looked like it was darkness, because the darkness was just swallowing every bit of light that it could get. And I walked into the building, and there were the brothers on stage, all of them, Michael included, rehearsing on a 110-foot wide stage. Now, back working with ZZ Top, they had taken one of the biggest stages in history out on the road. It was a stage shaped in the shape of the state of Texas, and tilted at an angle so you could see that it was Texas shaped. And it was 75 feet. And here the brothers were on a 110-foot stage. So I waited until they finished their rehearsal, and then we went out to their dressing trailer. Have you ever been in a dressing trailer? It's this mobile trailer, but it's all set up as a dressing room. So it had banquettes of seats on one side and on the other side, facing each other. And then a tiny little banquette next to the door. And that tiny little banquette was the throne. So Michael took the throne, and I took a seat at his immediate left hand, so I would be non-threatening. And if I had been at his right hand, I would have been threatening. And the brothers crowded around us. Now, you have to understand that the tour was in terrible trouble. The press had been trying to destroy the Victory Tour. That had started before I started with the Jacksons. My job was to try to undo it and figure out who was doing it and stop him. And one of the accusations made against the tour was made by a guy named Dave Marsh, who was Bruce Springsteen's biographer and one of the highest placed people in what was called the rock crit establishment, the rock critics establishment. And anything that Dave wrote, everybody else imitated. And Dave kept saying, we know all the people in this business. And the Jacksons have not hired any of the people we know to build their stage. And they have not hired any of the people we know to build their lighting. And they have not hired any of the people we know for their sound system. And they have not hired any of the people we know for security. So the stage is going to collapse. The sound system, it's all going to be amateur. The sound system is going to electrocute the performers. The 40-foot high towers for the lighting are going to collapse on the audience and kill people. And because the security is going to be amateurish, there are going to be gangs running up and down the aisles with knives, so you don't dare take your kids to a Jackson concert. And I did not know why the Jackson tour was susceptible to this kind of criticism. And sitting there in the dark in this trailer across from Michael explained it. He said, a year and a half ago, I started putting this tour together. And I found the best lighting people, and the best staging people, and the best magicians, and the best security people. And I signed them all to NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. In other words, they were sworn and signed to utter and complete secrecy. Why? Because of Michael's absolute commitment to give a total surprise to his audience. And why? Because Michael knew he had a quality of awe, wonder, surprise, and creativity that was totally beyond the normal. Totally. Not even on the same scale as brilliant people like John Mellencamp and Prince. And he felt that because God had given him that gift, it was his job to give that gift to his kids. So Michael began to explain why he was canceling the tour. He said, my brother Jackie is the best dancer I've ever seen in my life. Now think about that, Melanie. Michael Jackson has studied Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, James Brown, every dancer you could possibly find. And he's deliberately learned everything he could from them so he could do something better than what they provided. In his mind, so he could get to their level. But in reality, someone trying so hard to get to their level that he went twice, 3 times their level. So when Michael Jackson tells you somebody is the best dancer he'd ever seen, that is an expert opinion. It's not an arbitrary opinion. And Jackie had come down with a bone chip in his knee and had had arthroscopic surgery. And the surgeons felt, because I did the press conference at the hospital with the surgeons, and they felt that he would be better in 3 weeks. And it was now 4 or 5 weeks, and he was not better yet. And they had no idea of when he would be better. So Michael was explaining to me that how much he owed his audience, absolutely the best. And as he said that, I've had very few visions in my life. Every single one of them has proven true. I had what was my 3rd vision. And I saw Michael's chest, his ribs were golden gates. And I saw those golden gates of his ribs swing open. And I saw his kids, 10,000 of them, inside of him. And I saw how he would protect their right to awe, wonder, surprise, truth, and anything, health, anything he could provide them, at any cost to himself whatsoever. His commitment was absolute. And that was the first law of science. The truth at any price, including the price of your life, the law of courage. There it was in front of me, incarnate in a human being. I had never expected to see anything like it in my life. But Michael knew truths, and when he knew truths, he spoke with the power of a prophet. And I know truths, And on those occasions, when I know them to the very foundations of my gut, I come across with the power of a prophet. And so I explained to Michael how the press had made the public, his kids' parents, doubt his tour, doubt its safety, doubt its professionalism, and how if Michael canceled his tour to wait until Jackie was better, he would validate every accusation made against the tour, and his kids would never get the chance to see the show he had been working on for over a year with all of these extraordinary, talented people. They would never get a chance to see it. Their parents would not dare let them go. So Michael decided not to cancel his tour. And those two events, the session at the pool table in Marlin's pool house, and that session and that dressing trailer, were my two most important encounters with Michael. And one showed how he was the second law of science come alive in flesh and blood. The second law, look at things right under your noses if you've never seen them before. And the first law of science was a second meeting. Courage, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. Michael's absolute commitment to his kids.
Wow.
And
Wow,
frankly, Melanie, but those were two of the most important events in my life.
I can imagine.
Because I needed to see those two laws that I'd been committed to. They were my religion. I'd been committed to them since the age of 10. The reason I could believe there was no God was I was already committed to something else. The truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before. So Michael, from that point on, Melanie, Michael has been alive in my heart continually. Even in the years since the 11 years since he has died, he is in there. He is inside of me. And the need to redeem him has been so primary that I mentioned to you before that I appear weekly on 545 radio stations on a show called Coast to Coast. And it is the highest rated overnight talk radio show in North America. And back in the early years when I started to do it, my producer approached me. She called me one day and she said, "Could you please stop talking about Michael Jackson?" Because Michael's imprint on me was so profound. He so represented the values that I believe in that I couldn't stop talking about him. I couldn't stop trying to get across who he really was. Because here's a little story that's in the book. In 1954, all of the physiologists said it was impossible for a human ever to run a mile in less than 4 minutes. And Roger Bannister, a medical student, and another medical student started analyzing every move that Roger Bannister made when he was running. Every little inefficiency in his running, everything that wasted just 2 joules of energy that they could correct. And finally, Roger Bannister did what the physiologist said was impossible. He ran the 4-minute mile. And ever since then, the impossible deed of running the 4-minute mile, 1,800 people have run it. 1,800 runners have now run the 4-minute mile. Well, I have felt that Michael's quality of awe, wonder, surprise, and commitment was so enormous that if we just got it across to our fellow human beings, it would set a new standard of awe, wonder, surprise, and commitment. And once you set a new standard, people live up to it. And eventually, instead of just living up to it, they use it as a staircase and they stand on it. And they start building a staircase to an entirely new level. And Michael, to me, is somebody who, if only people knew who he was, he pushes the perceptual boundary of humanity itself. But people have to know who he was for that push of the perceptual boundary to exist. I mean, there's another story that relates to this. I had a client once when I was running the East Coast Public and Artist Relations Department for ABC Records. They had signed a guy named Bill Chinnick. And Bill Chinnick's songwriting was very undistinguished, and his voice was undistinguished, but there was something special about his guitar playing. And one day he was playing at a tiny club in New Jersey, and there was a little old man in the back of the audience. And when all of the rest of the audience left, the little old man came to the foot of the stage and said, "Son, how the hell did you do that?" And Bill Chinnock said, sir, I grew up listening to Les Paul records. And I would put a stack of Les Paul records on the record player spindle. And I would sit there all day trying to be able to play the way Les Paul played. And it took me 3 years, but finally I was able to play the way Les Paul played. And the little old man said, son, I am Les Paul. Don't you realize I invented multi-tracking? In other words, the guitar on the Les Paul record was 8 Les Pauls. And Bill Chinnock had actually managed to play like 8 Les Pauls. That's what the example of somebody setting an entirely new standard can do for humanity. And that's what Michael Jackson, beyond anything, I was about to say he wasn't human. I don't mean that. What I mean is he was human in a degree that brought him closer to the angels. He was more like an angel than like a normal human being. And people have to understand that. So in the same way that Bill Chinnock was able eventually to play like 8 Les Pauls, somebody can somehow can be like 8 Michael Jacksons. And that will push the perceptual boundaries of humanity, and it'll push the boundaries of potential, of human potential, to all of humanity. And that must happen. And it must happen before I die, because, look, Melanie, this is going to sound very strange. A couple of years ago, I began to get the feeling that I was the only one around Michael Jackson who understood him. And I knew that that couldn't possibly be true. Because look at the quality of the minds that Michael had around him, Quincy Jones and David Geffen in particular. Those are very perceptive people. And certainly they should have gotten Michael Jackson. But over the last year, in talking to Michael Jackson fans, and in particular Ben Owen, who is this Michael Jackson fan in Australia, who's just been enormously helpful to me, Ben says, no, you were the only person who understood him. That's why he trusted you. That's why you were the only person he would listen to. You had prophetic strains within you, and he had prophetic strains. And he knew that when he spoke, you would hear what he said. And he felt understood for the first time. But Melanie, I so wished that he were still here, because remember that scene where I saw the door open 4 inches and I knew there was trouble? None of the brothers said there was trouble. I just knew there was trouble. And it took me 20 years to figure out what in the world the trouble was. And then a way of articulating it came to me. The brothers had hired me to save their brother Michael's soul. And I was never able to accomplish that. The people who were manipulating, the person who was manipulating Michael and creating all of the negative press, got me thrown off the tour eventually, because he knew I was onto him. I mean, I imagine that's why I got thrown off the tour. I mean, at one point, the brothers were in New York City, and Epic Records gave them an entire conference room to use. I had never seen that before in my history with record companies. And somebody walked into that meeting and said, you've got to get rid of Howard Bloom. Howard Bloom was a spy from Prince. A spy from Prince? Are you kidding me? Prince was following his own independent path. It was very different than Michael Jackson's path. He wasn't learning anything from Michael Jackson, because like Michael Jackson, he was a true original, and he was true to the gods within him, the very things that I had wanted to track down at the age of 13. And they were very different gods. So there was no way that Prince was the least bit interested in spying on Michael Jackson. But that's how low whoever it was that was trying to blast me apart from Michael was willing to go. And eventually it worked. So I never got to talk to Michael again in my life, and it's one of the greatest losses of my lifetime.
Well, one of the things that you certainly mentioned in the book, in fact, one of the last chapters is titled "Who Killed Michael Jackson?" And as a fan, a lifelong fan of Michael Jackson, it was hard to read. But you bring up some people, and you already mentioned Dave Marsh, but there's also tabloid journalism you talk about. Explain why you titled that chapter that.
Well, because there was somebody out to make trouble. with the tour. At one point, the Jacksons were putting the tour together, and they were looking for a promoter who would promote the tour. And they were entertaining bids from all kinds of people. And the lawyers had drawn up contracts for these promoters. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with a lawyer, but you can sit down for lunch with somebody and have a wonderful relationship with them and be very excited about working together. And then you can turn over the process of writing a contract to your lawyer. And your lawyer can be the mildest mannered man on the cosmos, but he or she will write up a contract that makes the other person sound like a criminal. That would destroy your relationship with this person. So you have to go over the contract line by line by line and change it. And in fact, that's what I saw Tito and Marlon doing, going over the contract line by line by line and changing it. And in particular, adding that there should be between 100 and 300 tickets given for free every night to kids who could not afford to buy a ticket. Well, meantime, the normal ticket prices in those days were $12.50, and the Jackson ticket price was going to be $30, and nobody knew why. I didn't know why until I had that meeting with Michael. It was because it was going to be the most expensive tour to put together that you've ever seen, at least up to that point. And somebody who knew exactly how to manipulate the press leaked the initial contracts, the ones that came from the lawyer before the Jacksons were able to go over them, to a press person, a high-placed press person. Now, you have to know how the press operates. A social commentator named Thomas Carlyle in 1837 wrote about what the equivalent was of the rock crit press elite in his day. In his day, there were critics who wrote about plays, because plays were the popular art form of the time. And they could tear any playwright apart, and they could tear any actor apart. And in trying to explain how they operated, Carlyle talked about a friend of his who was out in a meadow one day. And there are these very narrow paths. If you want to walk, it sounds very wonderful and bucolic to walk with your girlfriend by the side of a farm. But in fact, it's very difficult because there are these very narrow pathways, and the two of you can't walk side by side. You have to walk in single file. It's very hard to hold hands that way. Well, it turns out those paths are sheep paths. And that when sheep are driven from one place to another, they're driven in single file down those paths. So one day, Thomas Carlyle's friend, this writer in Germany, saw a bunch of sheep coming down the path, went to a clearing, stuck his cane out, and the lead sheep jumped over it. And then he withdrew his cane. And every one of the remaining 1,999 sheep jumped at exactly the same spot, even though there was nothing to jump over anymore, just because the lead sheep had done it. Well, if you are really smart and know how to work with the press, you know who the lead sheep are, and you focus on those lead sheep. And somebody knew that, and somebody took one of the lead sheep, Michael Goldberg, an investigative journalist from Rolling Stone, and not only fed him these insidious contracts, these outrageous contracts, but also fed him a storyline, which is the Jacksons lead a lifestyle that is beyond that of princes and kings. It costs them a lot of money. They no longer make money now that they are not the Jackson 5 anymore. Only Michael is making money, and they're vampirical. They want to suck the blood out of their brother with these $30 ticket prices, so they have enough money to live for the rest of their lives. And the story was false. It was false. But that story made it into Rolling Stone, and because Rolling Stone is a lead sheep, People magazine and all the rest of the press, The Sun in England, everybody imitated that story. Everybody repeated the same story. And that's how the trouble began. So my job was to find out who knew how to make this happen and who was causing the problem. And there is a man in the industry who has an assistant, or he has a right-hand man. And his right-hand man is the son of the most brilliant publicist of the 20th century, Lee Salters. The son is Larry Salters. And that son is not very bright. His father was brilliant, but he's not very bright. It doesn't matter. He has been given the family lore by his father. And he knows that the press are lead sheep, and he has relationships with the lead sheep, and he knows how to manipulate the lead sheep. So it was my suspicion that he had leaked these contracts to Rolling Stone. Now, why would a person do that? Well, 10 years ago or so, I was in LA, and and a German group of Michael Jackson fans had flown in to go to Neverland. And they asked if they could meet with me. So we met, and it was wonderful. It was magic. It was so good to be among other people who believed in Michael as much as I did. And they said, well, you've got to read a book called Hitmen, when I was
Mm-hmm.
talking about somebody who knew how to do this manipulation. And they sent me pages from Hitmen. And it said that there was one person in the industry, Irving Azoff, who was absolutely addicted to power and money. And Irving is a brilliant, brilliant man. He's the only other person in the music industry, aside from me, who knew how to operate the star-making machinery. The only other one. But there's a big difference between Irving and me. Irving, I am totally committed to the truth at any price, including the price of your life. He has no moral compass whatsoever and will do. Who had the right-hand man who was capable of doing this leaking. So I think, and the book, Hitman, said, if Irving wants in on something, he causes trouble. He doesn't know how he will be able to use that. And got himself a job as a tour consultant for $500,000, $500,000. Now, these days in the music industry or the entertainment industry, that's pocket change. In those days, that was a lot of money. But then something else took over, Melanie. When we were out on tour, we traveled with an entourage of over 200 press people, 200 journalists. And every night I would give a press conference. I would spend the entire concert wandering around looking for unusual things that were happening backstage. And then I would show up with my notes at the press booth and with 200 people with their little laptops. And I would read them all of my notes. And one of those press people told me a story. He was with a paper called the Boston Herald American.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Boston, there were two newspapers. There was the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald American. The Boston Globe was a high prestige paper, and the Boston Herald American was a low prestige paper. And the Boston Globe outsold the Herald American by 20,000 copies a day. And this journalist covering the Jackson tour said one day the publisher walked into the bullpen, walked into the area where the writers all work, and the newsroom, and said, tomorrow we're putting Michael Jackson on the cover. And everybody in that newsroom rebelled. They said, we are not a tabloid, sleazy celebrity rag. We are a newspaper. We cover news. Michael Jackson is not news. We refuse to do this. And the publisher said, tomorrow Michael Jackson will be on the cover, and walked out of the room. So they put Michael Jackson on the cover the next day. Now remember, the Herald American undersold the Globe by 20,000 copies a day. The day they put Michael Jackson on the cover, the Boston Herald American outsold the Boston Globe by 30,000 copies. So the next day, the publisher walked back into the newsroom and said to one of his music journalists, I'm giving you a private office. I'm giving you your own secretary. I want a Michael Jackson story every day. And over at the Boston Globe, the publisher also walked into the newsroom and picked one of his music journalists and gave him a private office and a secretary to turn out a Michael Jackson story every day. So the publishers, Michael Jackson stories made money. And it turned out that Michael, if you couldn't get a positive Michael Jackson story, you could always find a negative Michael Jackson story. And guess which sold more copies? The positive or the negative stories? Yes, if it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah.
So that started what Irving started as a tiny snowball, rolling it down from the peak of a mountain down a hill, became an avalanche. So Irving helped kill Michael, and we all helped kill Michael. Why? Why do I mean we all helped kill Michael? Because we were the people who bought those extra 50,000 papers that allowed the Herald American to outsell the Boston Globe. We are the people who picked up every scurrilous, every outrageous, every sexual story on Michael Jackson. And there's one other thing you have to understand. One, and it has to do with Billy Joel. One day, Billy Joel was out on his motorcycle. He has a bunch of motorcycles and he loves them. And he was out on his motorcycle on Long Island, and he was doing whatever the speed limit was, 40 miles an hour, and he was coming to a green light. Now, what do you do on a green light? Do you go through it or do you stop? You go through it.
Right.
And so Billy went through the green light. Unfortunately, there was a car that had a red light coming perpendicular to him. And that car did not stop at the red light. It went to make a left turn, and it cut Billy off, and he put his brakes on, and they had no influence because there was too little distance. There wasn't sufficient braking distance, and he slammed into the side of the car, and he flew over to the opposite side of the car, and the driver, a 27-year-old woman, got out hysterical because she was afraid she had killed Bill. She didn't know who it was, but she was afraid she had killed this guy. And he was medevaced by helicopter to Lenox Hill Hospital, I believe it was, in New York, where they thought they were going to lose his right hand. Now imagine that. Billy Joel wrote a song called Piano Man because he only comes alive totally when he's in front of an audience on his piano. If he lost his right hand, we would be losing a public treasure. And he would be losing the thing that means more to him than anything else in life. Well, apparently then, the driver who had caused this accident by going through a red light went to an attorney. And the attorney must have told her, look, you don't understand what you've just done. You just had an accident with a superstar. This guy is worth a lot of money. So if you accuse him of hitting you, remember, after all, he hit you with his motorcycle, right? So if you accuse him of hitting you and you put the onus on him, you put the guilt on him, he's going to buy you off. He's going to settle out of court with you to keep from making negative headlines. So she did that, and she got $250,000. Now remember, that's a time when $250,000 was a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And so what do you think was going on with Michael Jackson? You had these remarkably unstable single women who had kids. Their marriages had broken up. Michael adored kids. He adored kids. And you remember your first sleepover?
Yeah.
It was so exciting. You stayed up all night long until dawn, just jabbering and talking. Well, Michael loved sleepovers of that kind. But were those sleepovers sexual events? I doubt it. Why? Because Michael Jackson's bedroom was not a private place. It was a public place. And once upon a time, I had another client, Lionel Richie. And Lionel had been called on to write the songs for We Are the World album with Michael Jackson, at least to write one song for it. So where did Lionel go to write a song with Michael Jackson? To Michael's bedroom. And the two of them lay on the floor like kids. And then Lionel says he suddenly felt something making eye contact with him from 2 feet off the floor, which is a bit unusual. And he turned his head to the right very, very slowly and cautiously. And what did he see? Michael's python muscles staring him in the eye, considering him for dinner. So that's the nature of Michael's bedroom.
Yes.
It's a public place, not a private place. And why did Michael love kids? Well, there's a researcher named Jaak Panksepp who happens to have visited me when I was stuck in bed here for 15 years. And Jaak is a brilliant researcher. And mice, baby mice, little tiny mice, child mice, play with each other. They rough and tumble and roll and squeal and have a wonderful time. But if you take those mice and isolate them at that age, so they can't play with each other, and then you let them loose when they're finally adults, they suffer from play deprivation. They actually need to get in the same amount of play that they would have gotten if they'd been allowed a normal childhood. Michael suffered from childhood deprivation. He started rehearsing with his brothers when he was 6 years old. He started going on stage professionally when he was 9 years old. He was performing before kings and queens when he was a child. He never had a childhood. So Michael adored kids. One day we were doing a shoot north of LA by about 110 miles. And we had these incredible cars being brought in, Maseratis and Lotuses and stuff like that for the photo shoot. And it took the photographers a long time to set up. So there were dressing trailers. Jermaine had his dressing trailer and stayed to himself all day because Jermaine wasn't part of the brothers for all practical purposes. He was his own person.
Mm-hmm.
The brothers hung out in their trailers, but Michael never went indoors in the trailers at all. There was a rough wood fence on either side of this stretch of 150 yards of park. And Michael went over to one of the fences where the kids were gathered and spent his entire time with the kids. Was he sexually interested in them? I seriously doubt it. One day, Frank DeLeo, his manager, who was the dumbest man I ever met in the entertainment industry. He had the brains of a piece of wood. But Frank told me something very moving. He said, I'm not supposed to tell you this. You're not supposed to know this. But every night before Michael goes on stage, he has me go to the hospitals and look for children who are dying, who have terminal cancer, and who've wanted more than anything else in the world to meet Michael Jackson. And he spends his time psyching up for his stage performance by spending 45 minutes with these kids. That's how committed Michael was to his kids. When I saw his ribs as golden gates, and I saw them open, and I saw 10,000 kids in his chest, that's for real, Melanie.
Yeah.
It may be a vision, but it was for real. So I doubt that there's no way any of us will ever know whether any of these sexual things occurred, but I don't believe them.
I don't believe it.
Maybe it's because I don't ever want to lose my belief in Michael Jackson because he stands for me, as I said, a living incarnation of everything I believed in since I was 10 years old.
Well, this is a good point. I want to go to Bud's right now because she has some questions from some of Michael's kids, as Michael put it.
Okay, good.
Buds, do you want?
Well, the one from Genevieve from Brazil, she asked several questions, but you covered some of the answers already. But she was asked about Sam Cooke's tragic life and how did you think it's parallel to Michael's, how they were treated in their life and how they were murdered?
Well, I don't know. She probably knows more about Sam Cooke than I do, but I worked with the Womacs, and Linda Womack was Sam Cooke's daughter. And so I run across Sam Cooke stories periodically. And Sam Cooke started in gospel, and then he left gospel. Well, gospel culture is very tight, and folks in gospel culture hate you if you leave the church. Because if you are singing church music, you are singing to God. If you are singing popular music, you are singing to women. And that is sinful. You are trying to get as many women as you can. And that is sin to them. So they despise and loathe anyone who abandons their fold. And Sam Cooke was one of those who abandoned their fold. So what happened with him and his sex life? I mean, and Michael had nothing like Sam Cooke's sex life with women at all. So there must be something that Genevieve knows about Sam Cooke that I don't know that she thinks is a parallel, and it might well be a parallel. But when we were traveling, all of us, on the tour, the Victory Tour, it was a huge tour. And we took over the top floor, 2 floors of the ritziest hotel in town. And there was a vegetarian chef in the hallway of the top floor, which was essential because all of us got free from stage stuff at a time of night when there was no such thing as room service. And without the vegetarian cook there, we would have starved. But Michael traveled with a gorgeous woman in her 40s, who was the mother of 3 kids, and who had her husband's permission to travel with Michael. And the 2 of them had adjoining rooms, and they could go through the doors from one room to the other. Now, was this sexual? I seriously doubt it. The husbands would not have given permission to these women if this had been sexual. It was not. And were there groupies around? Never. And were there children around? Absolutely not. Okay, Sam was also into buying music publishing catalogs. Okay, now that they may have in common, because once upon a time, well, I was sick in bed for 15 years, so that's a whole other story. But while I was sick in bed for 15 years, somebody introduced me to Priscilla Presley's common law husband. And he came out here to Park Slope, Brooklyn, to my brownstone to visit me. And I was still trying to track down who killed Michael Jackson, who had started those negative stories. And I had my suspicions, but I couldn't figure out a motivation. And when I finished telling the stories, he said, well, the motivation is simple, man. Michael is the only one the Beatles would have allowed their catalog, their publishing catalog, to be sold to. And according to J. Randy Taraborelli's book on Michael, when Michael heard that the Beatles catalog was available, he practically jumped in the air and clicked his heels, and he sent out a whoop. He was tremendously excited by it. So according to this guy's story, Priscilla Presley's common law husband's interpretation of things, Irving would have been after the Beatles catalog. He would have been using Michael as a tool to get the Beatles catalog. Now, actually, Irving Azoff did manage to get the money together at MCA, which he was running at the time, and was sending two of the most prominent people in the publishing industry to England to conclude a deal to buy the ATV catalog that had all of the Beatles stuff. And John Branca, Michael's attorney, once Michael had yipped and hollered and clicked his heels in the air, John Branca called Irving Azoff and somehow persuaded him to stop these two music guys from flying to England to conclude the deal. Now, Irving doesn't do these things for nothing. Irving does these things for a reason. John Branca got 5% of the Beatles catalog for being Michael's attorney. And I believe he was an attorney who would have sold Michael out and did sell Michael out, period. And if he got 5%, my guess is that Irving got something like 5% of that catalog. So all Irving knew was that Michael was the biggest crowbar in the entertainment industry of his time. What do I mean by a crowbar? Michael had more power than anyone else in the industry because he was such a phenomenon. And Irving, once he got in on the deal, figured out ways, I would suspect, to get in on the publishing. These are all suspicions. I can't validate them, but these are what I've been gathering evidence to that supports these things over the years.
Buzz has another question for you. Buzz, do you want to ask your question?
Well, you spoke about in your book, you say a lot of things, but early in the book, you talk about molecular social groups and how
right.
the energy is focused on one thing. And then also at the end of the book, you talk about soul sharing, that the artist is sharing their soul with the audience and the give and take. And
right.
Michael had also spoken about that many times. He said,
oh, I didn't know that.
Huh?
I didn't know that. If you have those quotes, send them to me.
Yeah, I will. He actually did say that he's been doing it all his life, that he puts it out and they feed back to him and he feeds it back. So
right.
It's back and forth between.
Yes, exactly. It's what I called it a reverberatory loop.
Yes.
Because I've experienced that performing too. You know that from the book.
Yeah, he said he'd been doing it his whole life, meaning even when he was a kid. So phenomenon. Right. Doesn't even really come close to what he was. I mean, he was just an amazing human being as far as I'm concerned. But so my question was, since he did the soul sharing so perfectly with his audience, I'm wondering if that's why his audience worldwide is so dedicated. I mean, we feel like he's our brother or our son, or, we're tight with him. Even
well, I've got this line in the. Well, I've got this line in the book that says, if you loved Michael Jackson, then you knew him far better than any of the writers who have ever written about him. Why? Because there's a resonance in you. And what are you resonating to? You're resonating to his generosity. You're resonating to his awe and wonder and surprise. You're resonating to his commitment. And you recognize these things even when you're told over and over again that Michael is a sexual predator, and that Michael is a criminal, and that Michael is a monster, and that Michael is a villain. You recognize those qualities in Michael at a gut level, at what I call it the level of the selves below the floorboards of yourself. You recognize it on an instinctual level. Your soul resonates to Michael's soul. And the story that I was telling that you were referring to is the story of the supersaturated solution. If I have you over at my place, and I go out to the kitchen, and I take 5 ounces of salt, and I dissolve it into a cup of water. It's a huge amount of salt. And I dissolve it so that the water is perfectly clear. And I put the glass of water in front of you. It looks like any other glass of water you've ever seen. But if I have you drop one tiny crystal of salt, almost invisible to you, into that glass of water, suddenly all of the salt molecules in that water recognize this one salt crystal as a gathering place. And they all gather around it. And those 5 ounces of salt come together as a big, very ugly and irregular crystal, but a great big crystal. And there are certain people who become icons. My job in the music industry, if you deserved it, was to make you an icon. For example, Prince was an unknown 19-year-old from Minneapolis when I started working with him. And an icon sets off a resonance in other human beings who recognize themselves in him or in her. And that person, the him or the her, the star, the superstar, represents a part of ourselves we can't even articulate, but is articulated through the body motion, through the muscular set, and through the life, especially in Michael's case, through the life of the person, the superstar. So you do know Michael if you love him more than any of the critics. Dave Marsh, for example, wrote a book about him. What do you think is more accurate? Your gut sense of Michael or Dave Marsh's book? It's your gut sense of Michael.
Absolutely.
And so what I'm trying to do is articulate this so that you know why you love Michael. And you have social permission to champion Michael. And you're not an outrider or an outsider for championing Michael, so that you know you are championing a genuine truth. So you know you are championing somebody who, if anybody ever brought divinity to earth, it was Michael. At least of the people I've met in my lifetime. I never got to spend any time with Jesus or Isaiah or the Buddha or any of those people. But Michael is on a par with every single one of them. I am telling you that from personal experience.
Right. So let me ask you this. This is the second part of this discussion. As I told you before we started the meeting, that we champion his humanitarianism, and we promote people who fight against these liars who perpetuate these stories. And the media is still doing the exact same thing that you described. Somebody writes something and then it's copy pasted all across, and it's all majority is negative. So my question to you is, with all this love that we have for Michael, what do we do? What is the best way to fight that? I mean, it's been going on for
well, I used to, my job in the music industry was to take people who nobody liked and to see their genuineness. It would take me 1.5 months to 2 months to do that. And then to tell the story of that genuineness to the press, doing it to the lead sheep. I had spent years and years cultivating my relationship with lead. And so my job was perceptual turnarounds. When something was genuinely valid, I showed that to the press until finally the press embraced it. And I did it by turning around the lead sheep. Nobody is doing that in the entertainment business anymore. If you came to me as a potential client, I would say to you, look, if you expect me to fashion an artificial mask for you, what you might call an image, and to sit here like a guy in a plaid suit with a big cigar in his hand and say, kid, I'm going to make you a star with this image, I would send you to my best competitor immediately. You'd be in his office having a meeting within 2 hours. If you were going to work with me, I told you, you have to understand that music is not an exchange of pieces of plastic. Music is not an exchange of downloads. Music is not an exchange of money. Music is an exchange of human soul. And when and Michael, as you just said, understood that. So Michael and I never had that discussion, but I wish we had, because we would have been two brothers in prophecy of the soul.
Right.
Mhm.
And I never had a brother in what I was doing. You know, I never had a partner, somebody that I felt understood what I was doing.
Right.
So I needed that as much as Michael did. But
Okay.
the fact is, Michael is gone.
I was going to say, do you feel like because your childhood was also rather stunted, like you were alone and you didn't have anybody, and he was alone too, even though he had his brothers, he actually felt very lonely. Do you feel like that's
Right.
why you're able to understand him so well?
I think that's a good insight. I think it's one of the reasons I was able to understand him so well. We both suffered childhood deprivation. We both suffered it. But look, we ended up as gifted people.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes,
that means
very
that all of those curses and tortures that were heaped upon us turned out to be gifts in disguise.
Right.
And yes,
He also said that he would
we
never
shared that.
change anything. He said that he would never
That
change anything in his life, even though it was really hard to suffer through.
and I would never change anything in mine either. I couldn't be what I am today
Yes.
if it weren't for all of those tortures.
Yeah.
So I am glad for those tortures, even the torture of being sick in bed for 15 years. Look, I was too weak to speak and too weak to have another person in the room with me for 5 years. And I wrote 3 books, and I founded 2 international scientific societies or scientific groups. And I sold one of those books against all the odds. It took me 4 years and 43 turndowns to sell it, but I sold it while I was too weak to talk.
Wow.
Wow.
So, and I learned things from being stuck in that bed. And now when we have the COVID crisis and we're all stuck working from home, hell, I've been working on the internet from home since 1988. So this is perfectly natural.
Exactly.
Then you
For
know
me.
what we're all dealing
Yes,
with. Absolutely.
right. So I think, Buds, that you were making an extremely good point, that you just pointed out areas in which Michael and I could have connected if we had had more time together.
Right.
That would have been very, very deep and very, very profound.
I think
But,
very freeing too. Very freeing.
Yeah, liberating for me.
Yes.
You know that Michael liberated me because I saw my ideals come to life in him.
Right.
And that was a tremendous validation of those laws, which I felt I would carry around inside of me and no one would understand for the rest of my life. And all of a sudden I had somebody who not only understood them, but was them.
Right.
It was astonishing. And so I regret not being able to have further conversations with Michael, because I never had another conversation again once they threw me off the tour.
Right.
And the brothers, I've wanted to get back in touch with the brothers because we were like brothers.
Right.
But I haven't been able to do it. Even Harrison Funk, who I put out on the road with the Jacksons as their photographer, hasn't been able to help me get to the Jackson family.
Yeah.
And it's not the highest thing on my priority list. I have a lot of very, very important things to do. This is the most important period of my life right now.
Right.
I have 2 more books to write. And with this particular book, I need to redeem Michael Jackson. Why? Not just because Michael Jackson was a popular culture icon, but because Michael represented truths that I think people need to understand in their daily life, whether they like music or not, whether they like Michael Jackson or not. Michael has a message for them that's my message too.
Yes.
And I feel it's important to deliver it. So I'm very fortunate that the reviews of the book say this is a page turner, even if you're not the least interested in music. And they say that this is a contribution to literature that will last for hundreds of years. And hopefully it is, because we should all be aware of the potential for soul in our lives.
Oh, yes.
We should all be aware of the gods inside. We should all be aware of the power of awe, wonder, and surprise. We should all be aware of the power of a commitment to truth. And those are the things this book is really about.
We have another question from Casey, who's in the audience there. He wants to know, Michael's nephew, Taj Jackson, is doing a documentary on this, hopefully to review. Are you aware of this documentary?
Right. I'm vaguely aware of the documentary. Taj and I said hello to each other on Skype or something like that very briefly. Taj is involved with the MJ cast. I appeared on the MJ cast a couple of weeks ago. I actually suggested that we put together a Michael Jackson film festival of all of the films exonerating Michael.
That would be great.
And I think it would be a fabulous event. It's just that I'm off doing so many other important things right now that I tried to follow it up, and I got to a dead end. And it would have taken more time than I have to get past that dead end. I mean, remember, the Michael's legacy is controlled by evil people, in my opinion. Within a year of Michael's death, his attorney, John Branca, and the others involved with the estate, threw a press conference, and they bragged that now that Michael was dead, he was worth twice as much as he had been worth when he was alive. What does that show you about how much they valued Michael Jackson's life? They did not value it at all. They were only interested in the money. So getting them to give us a release for these films would be incredibly difficult, especially when I'm an enemy of Irving Azoff, who is probably behind the scenes manipulating these people. I always thought, and I could be totally wrong, but I always had the impression that John Branca was Irving Azoff's puppet.
I can tell you that, Howard, that I've met Mr. Branca several times, and the person you're describing is not the person that I know, who knew.
Okay, so I may be wrong.
Okay.
So tell me a little bit more about John, because he's obviously very bright. That you can tell from a distance. But so you don't think that he would? I mean, but why did these guys throw a press conference and brag about Michael's estate being worth far more when he was dead? Isn't that something that would horrify you or me?
It certainly would horrify me, and I heard it. I had the same reaction when I heard it. But I've also talked to Mr. Branca about Michael's legacy, and it's something very important. And they have to deal with a lot.
Right.
And the documentary that came out a year ago does not help at all. So, and they care about getting the truth, and they care about Michael's legacy. Now, I'm not here to be a cheerleader for the estate.
Well, good.
I'm telling you that the person you're describing is not the person that I know.
Well, I am open to correction at any time. Remember, the truth at any price, including the price of your life.
Right.
Sure.
I met him as well.
He got it.
Well, I didn't get any negative feeling. I felt a lot of love for Michael when I met him.
Well, that's good. That's good. But there was something that there's a very important story to understand what was going on around Michael while he was alive. And Peter Frampton came into my office one day, the office at Lexington Avenue and 55th Street with the 2 stories and the circular staircase. And he told me the following story. He said that remember, Peter Frampton sold 14 million copies of a record. And no one had ever done that, ever. It wasn't until Michael sold 36 million copies that Peter Frampton looked small. Up until then, he was the record breaker, the record holder. And he said that his manager, D. Anthony, had started saying things like, well, you know, that road manager that you've had for the last 15 years, who you regard as a brother, as a member of your family, he was good for you when you were gold. He was good for you when you were platinum. Now you are 14 times platinum. And he has no idea of how to handle somebody at the level you just reached. Very few people do have an idea of how to handle somebody at the level that you just reached. So I know you love him like a brother, but will you please let me replace him? And so he replaces the road manager.
Mm.
Then 2 months later, he comes to Peter with another story. That lawyer that you've been with all these years, who was a brother to you, he's just not up to the multi-platinum level either. Can you please let me replace him with a lawyer who's capable of handling what you've become and taking it into the future? So Peter gets a lawyer, a new lawyer, and a new accountant, and is surrounded by new people that have been planted by his manager, D. Anthony. And then plus D says to him, look, you know, it's dangerous for you to go out. People will just want to touch you to get a hair off of your coat or a hair off of your head, some tiny little thing. And because they love you, they'll be capable of tearing you to pieces, which is also a story Michael told me once upon a time.
Mm-hmm.
And so don't go out. I will give you security guards. If you need to go out, they will go out with you. I will get you a suite at any hotel you want. Stay in, please, for the sake of your own safety. I will send you whatever you want. I will send you whatever you want sexually, young women, black, white, Asian. You just tell me. Young men, I'll get those for you too. But just stay safe. So now, if basically, D. Anthony had Peter Frampton in a perceptual cage. So if D. Anthony wanted Peter to believe that NASA had just discovered that the moon was made of green cheese, he would have the lawyer say, you know, I just read it in the New York Times this morning. NASA's just discovered that the moon is made of green cheese. And Peter, of course, would be incredulous, wouldn't believe it. And Peter would then turn to his road manager, who'd also been planted by D. Anthony, and say, is it true? Is the moon made of green cheese? And the road managers would say, yeah, I read it in the New York Post this morning. And then he would turn to his accountant, and his accountant would say, yeah, I just read it in People magazine. And by the end of the day, Peter Frampton would believe that the moon was made of green cheese.
Mm.
So I had the impression that people were trying to do that with Michael. I had the impression that Frank DeLeo was basically a plant because he was dumb as a brick. Now, Michael felt he was a genius.
He did.
Michael actually felt he was a genius. And Michael
mentioned the Hitman book, and
yeah,
a fan of the Michael has done an analysis of it. We have it on our blog if you want to read it. It's actually really interesting the way she connected parts of the book to what really was going on at the time and the time frame.
right,
It's really quite interesting
right.
how many different players were in there trying to get a piece of Michael and make him do what they wanted. It's quite interesting.
Right.
It's very, very interesting book.
And in the same way that I could be wrong about John Branca, I could be wrong about Irving Azoff, but I really don't think so.
Right.
I really don't think so.
Right.
All right. Howard Bloom, we want to thank you very much for being with us today. We're going to have you back. I want to show you a book again.
That sounds wonderful. Good.
I am telling every Michael Jackson fan, if you want to know something positive about Michael, but it's not just Michael. There are other stories in here of other artists that you've worked with. This is the infinitive book that you should get. It's called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, and it's by Howard Bloom.